Hello everyone, my name's Chris and today I'll be taking a good look at the Samyang 16mm f2 camera lens. It's designed for APS-C digital SLR cameras, although it will physically fit on an expensive full-frame camera, albeit with vignetting in the corners. It's a fully manual lens that costs about £350 new, which seems like good value. Wide-angle lenses with a fast aperture are always quite exciting to investigate, and this particular lens from Samyang currently holds a record. If you're using an APS-C digital SLR camera, like a lot of people do, then this is the widest angle lens you can get with such a fast aperture as f2. This thing lets in a lot of light. Samyang also make a 12mm f2 lens, which can cover an APS-C sensor, but that's only for smaller, mirrorless cameras. Makes me kind of want a mirrorless camera. Anyway, this 16mm lens's f2 maximum aperture makes it very useful for shooting at nighttime or doing indoor photography, and especially video work. You can also get a more out-of-focus background with such a fast aperture. f2 is a really lovely maximum aperture to have at your fingertips. The 16mm focal length is a very useful wide angle to play with, the full frame equivalent of about 24mm. It's a very popular focal length which gives you more dramatic wide angle pictures without stretching away into ultra wide angle territory. A lot of zoom lenses on APS-C cameras can go down to about 18mm. So is the 2mm difference really worth it? I actually think so. Here's an illustration I borrowed from a previous lens review. This is footage at 18mm, and now we have 16mm. As you can see, there is a real difference. In my experience, I've always found the wider perspective of 16mm to be a lot more attractive. Let's look at the build quality. This is really a typical Samyang lens. Everything is tightly assembled and the body feels very solid. It's not too big, but it is a bit heavy, being packed with a total of 13 glass elements. The most notable feature is that this is a fully manual lens with no autofocus or electronic contacts with your camera. The lack of autofocus isn't really a big issue, as this is such a wide-angle lens, and the manual focus ring is well damped, turning very smoothly and precisely. The lens has a manual aperture ring, which clicks between every half f-stop, although it's just a single click from f16 to f22. We can see that the iris mechanism has 8 aperture blades, which helps to produce smoother bokeh when the lens is topped down. The front of the lens accepts 77mm filters, and it doesn't rotate as you change focus, which is good news for people who use polarizing or graduating filters. It comes with one of Samyang's standard lens hoods. Overall, the build quality is really nice, and the lack of autofocus shouldn't be too off-putting for people, as it's not really hard to focus, especially if you use live view mode on your camera. Let's look at image quality. We'll test it on a 20MP APS-C camera, a Canon 70D. Samyang lenses are well known for being pretty sharp, and I can tell you now, this is the sharpest of their lenses that I've tested so far. With the aperture wide open at f2, the lens is already extremely sharp in the middle of the picture, with very good contrast levels and neutral colours. Impressively, it's almost as sharp in the corners too. I'm very impressed by the sharpness and contrast of this lens at f2. There is a touch of colour fringing to be found, but it's barely noticeable. Stop down to f2.8 and there is just a tiny touch more sharpness and brightness in those corners, and at f4 it really couldn't be any better. The lens remains this sharp even topped down to f11, although f16 and f22 are a touch softer due to the physical effects of diffraction. But overall, well, I don't think I've ever said the word sharp so many times in the space of 1 minute. It's normally a real challenge for lens manufacturers to correct aberrations on wide-angle lenses with fast apertures like this one, but that doesn't seem to have been a problem for Samyang at all, and the 16mm f2 presents itself here as a very high-performance lens. Just for fun, let's see how the lens performs on a full-frame camera in this case my 20 megapixel Canon 6D. The lens isn't designed for full-frame cameras, so obviously we see vignetting around the edges. When we look at the picture quality though, if anything, the lens is even sharper, giving perfect picture quality straight from f2 and at all other apertures, from the middle and into the corners, with no visible chromatic aberration. So it's technically performing perfectly on a full-frame camera, and it could be useful if you're prepared to crop quite heavily, of course. Well, let's look at vignetting and distortion on an APS-C camera. We can see some noticeable barrel distortion. It's not too bad though, about average for a wide-angle lens and much less than you might get with a zoom lens. Technically, at f2, the lens displays quite a lot of vignetting or darkness in the corners, but it falls across the image frame so gently that you never really notice it. Stop down to f2.8 and it's confined just to the extreme corners, and at f4 it's gone altogether. On the whole, vignetting and distortion are there, but you never really notice them much in real use. This lens can focus as closely as 20 centimeters, which is very close indeed, great for getting pictures of small subjects. The close-up picture quality also happens to be very sharp straight from f2, getting just a touch sharper at f2.8. That's a very good performance. When it comes to working against bright lights, the lens gives a fairly good account of itself, and that's especially important for such a wide-angle lens. We see some speckly flaring and a tiny drop in contrast, but that's about it, so no real problems here. Although the lens has such a fast aperture, it's not always easy to get an out-of-focus background in your pictures, simply because it projects such a wide angle, as well as working on an APS-C sensor, which always gives you more depth of field anyway. However, when you do get out-of-focus backgrounds, the quality of the lens's bokeh is very smooth indeed, even with quite tricky backgrounds. That's good to see. Well, let's sum everything up. People who watch my channel a lot will know that I really like testing Samyang equipment, basically because lenses of this quality keep showing up. Even though it's a manual focus lens, its build quality makes it a pleasure to use, and the very high image quality will make your pictures jump right out at you. There's everything to like about this lens, and it could be particularly useful for all kinds of indoor shooting, video work, or even astrophotography. It's even good value for money. Its only real competition on the market is the Sigma 18-35mm f1.8 art lens. The Sigma lens is one of the best I've tested, and its autofocus and zoom range obviously makes it more versatile. However, the Samyang lens is as wide as 16mm, which is a noticeably wider and more desirable focal length than 18mm, in my opinion anyway. The Samyang is also physically smaller than the Sigma lens, and most importantly for a lot of people, it's nearly half the price. The bottom line is that, if you want a very fast, wide-angle lens for your APS-C digital SLR camera that's good value for money, and does not compromise on image quality, then the Samyang 16mm f2 will deliver unquestionably. It comes very highly recommended.